Hi everybody, my name is Gabriel. Welcome to Table Talk. It's a series of videos where we look at important issues and answer them in a gospel-centered way. Today the question that we'll be asking and answering is, isn't Christianity a psychological crutch for weak people? And to answer this question and talk about it, we've got Denesh. Denesh is the head pastor at the Crossing Church here in Singapore. So let's get down to answering this question. So Dinesh, in Singapore and around the world, there's a popular view that religion in general and Christianity is a psychological crutch for weak-minded people. You know what they say? People who can't deal with reality need to believe in some sort of God to make sense of their world. And this isn't an idea that's popularized by the famous Austrian psychiatrist Sigmund Freud. So what do you have to say to that? Is Christianity a psychological crutch for weak people?
That's what I used to think myself growing up. I wasn't a Christian. And I used to think that of a lot of my Christian friends, that they can't cope with life. And so what they need is they need to invent this whole idea of Jesus or of a God who really cares for them and loves them so that they can cope with life. But after I've become a Christian and through the years, I've realized how wrong I was. And I think the question kind of has two assumptions to it, which I think are both wrong, actually. One assumption it makes is that the problem isn't really real. The problem that Christianity presupposes isn't really real. And secondly, that the solution isn't really real either. Let me try and unpack that. So I think when you say Christianity is a psychological crutch, you're presupposing that maybe the problem isn't really real. Or not just that actually if you're strong enough, if you're all together enough, if you're a person who can cope with life, then you can solve the problem on your own. You're not going to be a weak person. But here's the problem. In Christianity, the problem is sin. Now, what's sin? Well, on a very simple level, sin is just our selfishness, our lust, our jealousy, our covetousness. It's something that we all struggle with, and I'm sure you would agree, and I would agree, and anyone on the street would agree that we're all sinners in that regard. We're not perfect. We've all done bad stuff. But sin in the Bible has got another whole dimension and a more fundamental kind of meaning to it, which is actually sin is our rejection of God. God made us, He rules over us, but you and I, we turn our backs on God. We want to have nothing to do with God in our lives. So we kind of treat God like He's spam mail. We don't want Him in our inbox, and so we've kind of labeled Him spam. So every time people talk to us about a God, we just say, no thanks, I don't want to listen to Him. Or, if I use another analogy, imagine you go to a hotel and when you want to sleep, you don't want people to bother you. You put a do not disturb sign outside the hotel room door. And that's what we've all done to God. We've hung a big sign outside our heart. We say, do not disturb to God. See, that's the problem of sin that the Bible or Christianity is trying to address. It's a real problem that we all face. And the clincher is, not only is that problem real, but actually none of us can do anything to solve that problem ourselves. No matter how intelligent we are, how educated we are, how strong-willed we are, no matter what. We can't be moral enough or good enough or religious enough to solve that problem. And you might be thinking, well, that's a little bit defeatist. Why do you have to take such an extreme view that we can't do anything to solve the problem? Well, we can try with stops and starts to be a better person, but I think we kind of keep failing. Let me use an analogy to try and explain what I mean. So, for example, I'm a guy who likes to do New Year resolutions. And so with New Year resolutions, for example, I say, this year I'll run 3 times a week. I'll have a low-carb diet. I'll eat more vegetables and fruits. And, I'll treat my wife and kids better. And how long does it last? Well, it doesn't last very long. Maybe 2-3 weeks. The running thing, within a week, it's dead. And then all the other things, in a month or so, they don't do so well either. So even with my best efforts, I never keep my own resolutions that I make for myself. And that's kind of like you and I. We're just unable to deal with the problem of sin on our own. And even then, even if we try really hard, the problem is that God's standards are perfection. So unless you can attain perfection on your own, which we all can't, then it shows us even the best of us, the most intelligent, the most strong-willed, we cannot deal with the problem of sin on our own. Now that's looking at it from the problem perspective. It's a real problem. We really need help. Now let's look at it from a solution perspective. Again, I think saying it's a psychological crutch, Christianity is a psychological crutch, presupposes that solution might not be real. Maybe it's some kind of psychological trick in your mind. Some fictitious God really loves you. He really sent down this guy called Jesus. And so, it plays a mind trick on you, and then you believe that. But again, I don't think that does justice to Christianity. Jesus was a real historical person who walked this earth. Let me read you what one of his followers says about him. He says this in the book of 1 John. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life, that is Jesus, that life was made manifest. We have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. Now, these are astounding words, right? Because John, who writes this book, he's telling you about how he's related to Jesus. He's saying we've heard him, we've seen him with our eyes, we've looked upon him, we've even physically touched him. Jesus is a real historical person who walked this earth, ancient Palestine, 2,000 years ago. Not just that, he performed countless miracles in front of hundreds and hundreds of people who were his followers, people who were his opponents. They all saw him do stuff like that. He died on the cross to pay for our sins so that we can be forgiven. And not just that, but he rose again 3 days later. And we know he really rose again because more than 500 eyewitnesses saw him, the risen Jesus, over a course of a number of weeks. So the solution is very much real. It's a real historical solution. So to kind of summarize, we have a real spiritual problem, our sin that we cannot solve. We have a real historical solution, which is Jesus on the cross for our sins.
Okay, thanks, Denesh. So in short, Christianity is not a psychological crutch because it's real, that it's based in history. But what do we say to certain accusations against Christianity that it was actually invented in the Roman Empire, by the Roman Empire, to actually control the minds of people? So even though maybe there was such a guy called Jesus, but how can we trust that whatever you've just read in the Bible wasn't altered or doctored, right, to make Jesus more than he was, so that they could control the masses? I guess in short, the question I'm asking is, how do we know Christianity is not a belief system made up to manipulate people?
Yep, so I think that question often comes because people think, Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, he kind of became a believer, and then he basically forced everyone in the Roman Empire to become a believer in Jesus. But, I think the problem with that is, again, historical largely. Constantine comes 3rd, 4th century AD. But Jesus is in the 1st century. His disciples are in the 1st century. And what you have, therefore, a few hundred years before Constantine, before the Roman Empire embraces Christianity for itself, is you already have this belief system of who Jesus is, and these disciples running amok around the ancient world telling people about who Jesus is. So there's a historical time lag of a couple of hundred years. And initially, the Roman Empire was deadly opposed to Jesus. In fact, they were the ones that put him on the cross, and they were persecuting Christians for decades and centuries until Constantine. So there's a historical kind of problem with that way of thinking. But maybe just two other things. So one of the things that I found really fascinating when I was looking in on Christianity is to try and think about how the Old Testament actually relates to the New Testament. So the Old Testament is largely the history of Israel. It's written and completed 400 years before the coming of Jesus. And then the New Testament is essentially the life and teaching of Jesus and the early church. And there's this gap of about 400 years in between. If you look at the Old Testament, there are all these massive predictions about a coming king, a coming Messiah. And they tell us all sorts of things. They tell us the family line he's going to be coming from. They tell us what he'll do in his life, where he'll be born. They tell us even things about his death, how he will die, what the people, the bystanders around him will do at the place of his death. They will cast lots for his clothing. So all these predictions are made, and you're asking the question as you read the Old Testament, who is this guy? Who is this guy? And you come to the New Testament and you realize Jesus fulfills every single one of those prophecies or those predictions. The family line he comes from, where he's born, his mother will be a virgin, what he does in his life, all the miracles. It tells us about the way he dies, that he'll be pierced, that people will cast lots for his clothing. So you look at it and you ask yourself, now is that just an amazing coincidence, or is there more to it than that? Why is it that this ancient book, the Old Testament, can make all these predictions hundreds of years before Jesus even comes? And I don't think you could doctor something like that. I mean, people have said to me, well, maybe Jesus knew his Old Testament really well, and therefore, he kind of faked all these things. And I think you have to say, well, maybe he could have faked some of it, but you could never fake your birth, you can never fake your death and the circumstances surrounding it. And that's exactly what Jesus does. He fulfills it from beginning to end in his life. Another thing I would say, I find the disciples of Jesus fascinating. Because, you read the Gospels, right, the biographies of Jesus, and they're kind of like these bumbling fools. They never really understand Jesus, and they're always umming and ahhing on whether to really believe him or not. And when Jesus is captured, when he's about to be crucified, everyone denies him. They all run away because they're ashamed, they're terrified that they'll be captured by the Romans as well. Peter denies him 3 times himself. And you look at them after the resurrection, 3 days after Jesus is crucified, he rises from the dead, the disciples see him, and you look at these same scared bunch of disciples after the resurrection, and they're like the most courageous guys. They're running around the ancient world from city to city preaching the gospel of Jesus. And they're willing to risk their lives, and almost all of them die horrific lives. And you got to ask yourself, what caused that dramatic change? Why would they have become these terrified little guys to these courageous evangelists? Again, something significant has happened, and that is that they've seen the risen Jesus.
Okay, thanks for that, Denesh. So, in other words, Christianity can be trusted because historically it's consistent and there is evidence for it. But I want to pick up on something you said earlier. So clearly, Jesus is the central figure in the Christian faith, and the central event on which Christianity depends on is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, I think if we went out on the streets of Singapore and told somebody that somebody actually died and rose again, you might get a bit of funny looks, right?
Yeah.
So, how do we know that Jesus really died and rose again? I mean, isn't that just fairy tales for adults?
Yeah.
What evidence do we have of the death and resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the resurrection of Jesus really stands at the center of Christianity. And in fact, the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, in the book of the Bible, he says that, look, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we have to be pitied more than all men. So it's crucial that we try and understand the resurrection and to see that it's a real historical event. There's several things I could say. The first thing is, I think, back to what I said earlier, that the resurrection of Jesus wasn't just witnessed by, 1 or 2 guys who were, trying to hallucinating, and, they really missed this guy, and so they thought that they saw Jesus, and that's all we have to go on. No, actually, the Bible tells us that more than 500 eyewitnesses saw Jesus over the span of 40 days. Now, think about it. When I went to primary school and secondary school, my entire cohort was about 400 to 500 kids. And if you think about it, 400 to 500, that's that many people who saw Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. And they didn't just see him all at one go. You could say they saw him all at one go as mass hysteria or whatever. But they saw him over the course of 40 days. That's 5-6 weeks. Different people at different times. And some of them were resolute to not believe. There was a guy called Thomas, one of the disciples, and these days we call him Doubting Thomas, because all the disciples believed and he refused to believe until he saw Jesus for himself. So these are not, it's not a hallucination. It's not made up. These were not, some people say, oh, these were ancient people. They were really simplistic people. It was easy for them to believe all these things. No, that was not the case. These were real historical eyewitnesses who saw the resurrected Jesus. There's another thing to say, which is, again, that dramatic change of the disciples that I said. Now, why on earth would these guys change from being so terrified when Jesus was crucified to so zealous and courageous to preach the gospel. You got to ask yourself, what caused that change? A lot of people will say, oh, the disciples, they made up this whole stuff about Jesus being resurrected. Well, if you made it up, would you have that dramatic change? Would you risk your life in that way? To put it another way, would the disciples be willing to die for what they know is a lie? If they cooked up this whole thing of Jesus being resurrected, and then they go out there and they preach about Jesus being resurrected, and they're being persecuted, and they're being beaten up, and they're being put in prison and killed, you got to ask yourself, why would you do that? What have you got to gain? They didn't gain money, they didn't gain fame, they didn't gain women, which I guess are the three things people think that you gain from these things. They lost their lives and they were beaten up. Why would they die for a lie? I was reading this guy called Chuck Colson. He was actually under Richard Nixon, U.S. President Richard Nixon's cabinet, if you like, and Chuck Colson was involved in the Watergate scandal, and then he was put in prison. He then became a Christian in prison. Let me read you a quote from Chuck Colson. He says this: "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, and they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible." And I think that makes a lot of sense. What would they have stood to gain from that lie if they knew they fabricated this whole thing to begin with? But the fact that the disciples were willing to go to their death proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead, I think that's a massive point in the favor of the resurrection. I could say lots of other things. Maybe I'll just mention one more. The biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which record his life and his teaching, his death, his resurrection, they were all in circulation within 30 to 40 years of the death of Jesus. And that means they're within circulation, within the lifetime of people who would have heard Jesus for themselves and saw Jesus for themselves. If what they said about Jesus wasn't true, he didn't perform those miracles, he didn't teach those things, he didn't die on the cross, he didn't rise from the dead, well, then there would have been mass kind of opposition to that when these documents came onto the scene. But there is no recorded great disagreement with what the gospel writers told us about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I think there's lots of evidence. There's some non-Christian sources which write about a few things which correspond with the Gospels as well. So there's a whole list of things that we could go through. It's not just a made-up hoax. It's a real historical fact.
All right, thanks, Denesh. So finally, if I could just summarize what you've said so far, Christianity is not a psychological crutch because it is based on cold, hard facts and historical evidence. There might be some of us watching right now who are still skeptical,
Yep.
right? And obviously they might not want to take your word for it, and even though you've given us a few evidences. So what advice would you have for people that want to investigate the evidence for Jesus and Christianity for themselves?
Yeah, well, there's lots of things they could do. I think they could pick up a book if they want. I'll recommend 2 books in particular. There's a popular book called Case for Christ by a guy who was a former journalist in the Chicago Tribune. He was a non-believer. His wife became a believer. I think he wanted to prove her wrong. He investigated Christianity. He ended up becoming a believer. So the book is called Case for Christ. It looks at the evidence for a lot of things we talked about. There's another book, an older book by a scholar, historian called Paul Barnett, called Is the New Testament History? That's also well worth looking at. I guess in our church, we run different things. We've got 2 groups for people who could come and just investigate the claims of Christianity. They can come with their questions. They can come and be as quiet as they want to be and just listen in. One group is called Just Looking. It runs over 6-7 weeks, an hour at a time, to just look at the claims of Jesus for ourselves and to just make our own judgments about who we think he is. Another group is called The Reading Room. That's more chilled. It's once a month. We take a big topic related to God and this world, suffering and evil and science and the historicity of the Bible at different months. And you just come again and we discuss those questions and just think aloud about those questions together. So that's another way in which maybe we can be of help to people.
Thanks, Dinesh. If you'd like to find out more about some of the books and some of the groups that Dinesh mentioned, we're going to be putting the link down at the YouTube column down below, so you can click on it to find out more. Thank you.